Welcome to another episode of Health Creators. This is Liv, and I'm joined here today by Gandolf Finke, founder at MIKA. So, Gandolf, can you give us an elevator pitch of MIKA?
Sure. MIKA is a digital therapeutics platform in oncology. So we help cancer patients go through therapy all the way from diagnosis to reintegration, aftercare, or the end of life. With the platform, it's been used by more than 100,000 patients by now. It's clinically validated. We ran a bunch of clinical trials, RCTs, certified as a medical device, and we commercialize this with pharma partners. We do this on a global level. We have large pharma companies that we have great partnerships with, and we're at a stage where I think further expansion and further build out of the product is happening. We're a team of 50, 60 people based out of Berlin, presence in the UK, moving to the US. That's where we are.
And when did you start MIKA?
In 2017. So my co-founder and I both had people with cancer in their lives. I had worked in healthcare consulting before and have a deep interest in technology and healthcare. So everybody in my family is a doctor, so I was a little bit predisposed to go in that direction, I guess. That brought me to think about, are there everyday technologies that we could use to improve outcomes? So it's not always the newest drug that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I think that's something that became pretty clear in oncology. A couple of years after we started, there was a study that came out by a guy called Ethan Besch. A lot of people know him in the oncology space, who proved that just by monitoring symptoms, you could significantly improve the outcomes if you then react appropriately. So it wasn't even a new drug or anything. It was more because cancer patients are not in the hospital all the time, so nobody's watching after them all the time. But by just watching what symptoms they're experiencing and reacting to them, you could significantly improve outcomes. And so there were lots of data points that came along the way. We always had this hypothesis that we think the psychology plays a really important role. So it's not only about the drug or medical treatment, basically, but it's also about holistic well-being that plays a role. And there are studies that show that nutrition, exercise, and things like that play a really important role, and the mental health of patients as well. So that's what we focused on, right? So we see ourselves as a companion, not interfering with the medical treatment, but trying to make the best life for a patient outside the medical treatment that they're getting.
And why did you decide to focus on the kind of anxiety psychology component of cancer rather than discover a new therapeutic?
I think it's a highly underrated aspect. So about a third of all cancer patients actually develop a diagnosable psychological disorder or a disease, so depression, anxiety disorders, etc. So it's a really, really strong impact that they're experiencing. And the other 2/3 also are, of course, psychologically affected. I think everybody who has known someone with cancer can relate to that. That's the first point. And the second one is that it's not addressed at all in the system, right? There are not enough psycho-oncologists in this world to ever treat these people. It's also not the same as psychotherapy you would normally get if you're in normal psychotherapeutic treatment settings. And so we found there was really a big unmet need in that domain that fits really well into, or that's absolutely needed in this oncology, let's say, overall industry, right? It's a huge industry from a pharmaceutical perspective, and generally from a healthcare system perspective. But this is a missing piece that we think can unlock really superior outcomes compared to where we are.
I see. And like, how does it work with the family members like MIKA? Because I feel like a big component of someone going through cancer is also how it impacts, the family members, which you were one of, and why you started the company. Yeah,
so I think that's a really important topic, and I'm sure that there is more on our pipeline roadmap to do in that direction. I think that there are two sides to this. One is sort of what does the patient, him or herself, do to actually involve their social setting into this, right? So it's partially on them, but then partially that's also on this surrounding circle how can they contribute, right? And I think we're addressing the former part in terms of, we have courses and contents on how do I actually talk to my family about this, how to involve them, what can I ask them to do, what are important things to organize, etc. The other part in terms of what can others do is partially in there, and we know that actually a few of our users are not the patients but our loved ones, so they would use it for the patients basically, be it because of age or be it because they want to know things themselves, right? And if you think about things like physical exercise or a recipe of what's healthy to cook in that time, that's not something that's restricted to the patient necessarily, right? I mean, the exercise you can do together, the cooking you can do together or for the patient, right? And so I think there's lots of elements in there already, but primarily the product and also the intended use as a medical device is for the patient.
I see. And is part of this also, when you're talking about the kind of psychology component, how important is being positive in the outcomes? Like, are there studies to show that being positive about your prognosis essentially improves the chances that you survive?
Yes, I think there is early evidence on that, and I think we're in the fairly early days of understanding the biology behind it. What is actually and we're pretty excited about that, and we want to go deeper in that sort of biological aspect of this. How are stress hormones contributing to tumor growth? Right? There's a body of literature behind that, and we're very interested to explore that further and see how we can, forward-looking address, let's say, more than the quality of life side. Maybe there's even the actual cancer outcomes that we can affect with what we do. And I think that's a really exciting prospect to work towards.
Take me back to 2017, right? Sure. So you start this company, you've worked in consulting, but this is your first time starting a company and first time building a product, I guess. How did you approach getting started on this? I know, like you said, you had members of your family with cancer, and I guess those were maybe your first users, or how did you structure it?
Yeah, so we did two sides of research initially. One is sort of, the theory, right? What's there in terms of psycho-oncology. We have a wonderful partner at the University of Leipzig, Professor Mena Toyakov, who is one of the absolute leading experts in the field, and she was very positive about what we're doing and liked the idea, and so we had her, discussing ideas with her very, very early on, and then on the other side, of course, talking to patients, understanding what are their needs actually, what are they looking at, and even there's a body of literature, of course, on patient needs and unmet needs out there. So the two things we started off with, and I think the very first product that we had in the market was called MIRA, M-I-R-A, so a different brand. It's another story how that came to be, but it was a web-based product, and it was basically curating content, because one of the problems that you face as a patient early on is that there's so much information out there. So it's not the problem that there's no information. The question is, what's valid information, what is reliable, and what's actionable for me, and what's the right one for me. Right? Yeah. So not everything's the same for everyone, and it doesn't help you a lot if you read about, you should really eat a fiber-rich diet. Right? I mean, most people don't know what that is, but it helps if you get a recipe that entails that, right?
Yeah.
And so, but it might not be the right thing to eat if you're in a specific phase of the treatment.
Yeah.
So we started off with the hypothesis of, you need to, we don't have to actually reproduce all the content. There's so much content out there. Why don't we start with curating that?
Yeah.
So we had a product out that did that. Of course, it's very inconsistent in terms of, the tone of voice. It took the patients out of the platform into those external links and pages that we curated. So I think from a user experience, that was not a great product at all, but it allowed us to see and to test whether there's a need or an acceptance of what we're doing. Right? Do cancer patients even want to do something digitally when they're in this very, very difficult phase? Because they have, worries, very, very big worries in their lives, and maybe not the only thing is what can I cook tomorrow, right? And it's not the most important thing. But we found that we did a feasibility study early on at the University of Leipzig and at the Charité in Berlin, where we could show that there was a real need and acceptance of digital technology in this space. So from there, we took that forward to go into, okay, we probably need to develop our own content to do this. Right? So all the content you would see in MIKA is developed and owned by us. We took it forward to have a consistent tone of voice as part of that. We moved it to native app platforms, which allows for very different functionality. And one thing that came on in pretty early is that it wasn't only about content, but to understand what the needs of patients are, you need to understand a bit more of the situation. So not only what kind of cancer they're suffering from, but also what kind of treatment are they getting, maybe how old they are, because for some people, let's say reproductive health is important, right? You want to maybe freeze eggs if you're a young woman. You maybe, if you're in the working age, you still have career perspective to follow, but that's not the same for everyone, right? So age plays a role, and so on. And so I think MIKA allows now to really personalize around the profile of the patient, right? And that's where we also invested quite strongly into technology. So we use machine learning to recommend the right content.
Yeah.
Right. So think of it as in Netflix, right? When you look for the next show, it will recommend things based on what you've done before, what people like you have liked, etc. So we use sophisticated algorithms in the background to try to figure out, in this very large library that we created by now, what's the right thing that we want to recommend to the patient. And we can show that this works really well. Because I think that's actually a key thing. Cancer is different from many other diseases, and particularly also other chronic diseases, in that it's highly, highly individual in terms of how patients go through treatment. Right, so you have tumor boards that make decisions, and they may not even be made the same decisions in everywhere inside a country, even though you have the same guidelines. You have constantly new drugs coming to the market, and treatment paradigms changing. So we wanted to really make sure that personalization is a key aspect, and really happens. And I think that's a little bit different in other diseases where you have sort of more standard treatment that are used by a very, very large portion of the patients, right? So you could build a program for that. Yeah. But I think in cancer, it doesn't work to say, oh, we're going to have that 12-week program for breast cancer, and that's it, right? So, and we tested that it probably works for some patients, and maybe for many patients, but then you're limited to a breast cancer, which is already a huge indication, and at the same time, it won't fit with everyone in there.
I think this idea of new treatment paradigms is interesting for the patient aspect, because at the moment there's not really a way to communicate new research in a understandable manner, right? So I've literally seen patient groups on Facebook that focus on translating CTGov, because right now, when we talk about scientific literature or clinical research, it's never in layman terms, right? And layman terms is defined as like year 5 level science. This is like way beyond. Like even for someone with a science PhD, let's say, to understand what the current standard of care for any given cancer is quite difficult. So as part of, I wonder if part of what you're trying to build on the educational side is also like a translation engine for that.
Yeah, I think a little bit to differentiate. So I think our main role is not to suggest the right treatment, because we think this is done and should be done by physicians, right? So I think as a patient, you definitely have the right to understand it, and you are actually the decision maker.
Yeah.
But I think to explain all the details of every treatment is very difficult for us because we don't know enough about the patient. So we don't have the exact diagnosis from on the gene level, which the physician in some cases has. And so I think we would have to explain everything to the patient. And I think it's really hard for them to then make sense, even if they understand everything. So I think that I would take that a little bit apart, but I think in generally, sort of how does a surgery work, right? What are the possible outcomes, right? How would you possibly wake up afterwards? I think that's really important for patients to understand. And we know that when patients leave a physician's office, they won't remember 80% of what the physician told them. So there is this really, really big gap in terms of knowledge on the patient side. And partially this is caused by, let's say, communication differences between healthcare professionals and patients. But it's also the stress situation that the patient is in, of course. That's hard to process any information. And so what we do there, we actually had yesterday a really interesting discussion in the office on our efforts to take everything to a level of plain English or plain language or easy to understand language. And these are terms that are clearly defined, so I'm not saying them just like that. There's a whole science between how readable is a text and what are the scores in that dimension. And I think that's actually key if you consider that in Germany, almost half of the people have only level 1 or level 2 literacy level. Yeah. So these people would not understand a sophisticated newspaper article. So this is way below college level education. Yeah. And you can think that any scientific paper that's out there cannot be understood by half of the people, right? And even the other half, not all of them would understand it, right? So I think it's really upon us, and upon us, but actually the whole healthcare community that's communicating with patients, to ensure that patients really understand it. I mean, it's a legal requirement that patients have understood the consequences of the decisions, right? When you start chemotherapy, you sign something that you are accepting all these possible side effects, etc. And I'm not sure, or I'm pretty sure that many of them don't even get a chance to fully understand everything that's in there. And that's a lot to ask also, because some of this is very, very complex. And maybe you're asking too much from healthcare professionals, because it's not like they're not busy, right? We have more and more patients, and we have fewer healthcare professionals. And so I think that other systems like digital technologies can contribute to that, because what we do, you can scale. You can just have another user, and that costs you cents in terms of server, but nothing else really.
So you have this personalization component to MIKA, right? And then you don't actually interface with their patient records, but how do you help them figure out what their treatment even is? I know that you don't recommend the treatment, but if they have received something from their physician and in the moment they were super shocked by their diagnosis, how would you help them actually understand that?
So it depends on what it is, but generally we do explain a lot of the treatment path, right? Yeah. But I think this is sort of a question of level of granularity that you go into, right? So we wouldn't go and say, oh, this drug has compared to this other drug in a trial where side effect was that, but whatever overall survival, progression-free survival was that difference, right? So we wouldn't go to that level, but we would say, this group of chemotherapy drugs, that's typically what you get before surgery when you're in this stage. And so these are the side effects that most of them entail. This is how you can deal with it. And again, I think we're trying to help patients to live the best possible life with the treatment that they're getting, rather than giving them, all the information to make a treatment decision.
About the macro scientific effects, right? Like you just want to know how it impacts you. So that kind of makes sense.
Exactly, but I think it's still also it's a very touchy or thin line between empowering the patient to be a competent decision maker in the treatment without having the ability to give them all the information about it. Do you know what I mean? Like, we are talking about a class of drug, but we wouldn't necessarily talk about individual drugs, right? Unless there's something super special about them. And so I think it's we found our sweet spot outside actually the treatment stuff, because there's so much for patients to worry about.
Yeah.
For the drugs and all of that, they can actually call and talk to their treating physicians. Right? That's the person to talk to, and that person should know everything about it. But physicians do not know necessarily really well what to exercise, or where do I get a disability voucher, and what's my legal requirement to inform my employer about things. And so all these things are coming towards the patient, and I think the medical treatment side of it is to a large degree on healthcare professionals to do
you have to inform your employer? Sorry.
I mean, at some point, most cancer patients, probably more than 95%, will miss a significant chunk of time at work or completely drop out of the workforce. Right? So that's truth. So in Germany, at least, you have to have a piece of paper by your doctor that says basically this person is sick for however much time it is. And then for 6 weeks in Germany, the employer pays it, and then afterwards the insurance pays it, the salary, right? And until, I don't know, 1 or 2 years in, and then that changes. But so you don't have to tell your employer, what kind of cancer you have, etc. But I think it depends on employers.
That's such an interesting topic, right? Yeah. Because you would assume that if you were diagnosed with cancer, you just quit your job because you're like, okay, I don't know how much time I've left. But then who covers your living cost if you don't have an income coming in?
Yeah, I think probably in Germany at least, the advice is to not quit your job when you get a cancer diagnosis, because then you don't get paid anymore, right?
Yeah.
Or you get social welfare, which it's a discussion I don't want to get into, but I think that's very different. It's a very country by country thing, right? In the US, you have, in Germany also, but in the US you have huge financial toxicity. There was a statistic that I read a couple of months ago on, I don't know, it's a quarter or a third of all cancer patients that actually file for personal bankruptcy because of what they're going through.
Oh, really?
So it's
because they have to cover their own healthcare
exactly
costs.
So healthcare in the US is very differently, let's say, covered by, and it's also way more expensive. So those are the different needs in different countries. So our offering in the US, financial toxicity plays an even bigger role there. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I still don't really understand why you needed to be a digital therapeutic if you're just offering personalized content.
So we have a therapeutic impact. We decrease depression, anxiety, fatigue, psychological distress. We improve health-related quality of life, and that's a therapeutic impact that we have. And so in order to achieve that, we get data from patients. We use that data to tailor the experience that they're getting inside the platform, and that together brings the need of medical device certifications with it. And that's one thing. The other thing is we wanted to be one. So even before there was a DIGA law, and when other digital therapeutics didn't want to be a medical device because they didn't have to, we said, we're in oncology. This is so medical as a field. Like there's, physicians, hospitals, etc., will not take you seriously if you come across more as a lifestyle offering.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's also true, and it also forces you have some really strong standards in terms of quality in what you offer. So all the content that we produce is, produced under the guidance or by experts, reviewed by us, and then again, if it's medically relevant, reviewed by oncologists. So this is super expensive, right?
Yeah.
But this is a way of ensuring that whatever you get in the platform is safer for those patients to use.
And I guess you wouldn't be able to say that you had a therapeutic impact if you weren't essentially doing these studies to be a DTX.
Yeah, so depending on which risk class you are and where you are, you can probably claim some things without having run full RCTs. And I'm sure there's various perspectives on standards out in the field. We always wanted to show clinical trials. I mean, it's our way of showing that this actually works, right? And it has the impact that we claim, that we want to have, and that ultimately we also commercialize. That's also a business. I mean, we were built to improve the lives of cancer patients, and that's our vision and guiding thought. But I think it's still a business, and there needs to be revenue, and there needs to be salaries to be paid, right? And we cannot grow unless we have a commercial model behind it as well. And I think with the model that we are pursuing now, the two things go really well together.
It's reimbursed by DIGA currently?
No, so we were the first DIGA in oncology. We left that path for various reasons.
What's the main one?
Commercial viability.
Well, as in like the reimbursement scheme, did it cap the amount per patient or something like this?
Yeah, so after some time in DIGA, it materialized that there is basically a level of prices that's very constant, no matter the impact of the digital therapeutic in the clinical trial.
So there's like a ceiling.
All the other offerings, they're all at 250 euros plus minus, or even a bit lower.
So basically, it doesn't matter if I'm building an app for oncology or for anxiety, general anxiety. It's capped at the same cost per patient.
So nobody would tell you that it's actually capped, but nobody has achieved a higher price.
Okay.
It's also still early days, right? So I think we left the DIGA path for that was a big reason. Price is an issue, but also distribution. I think.
Does it limit you to only Germany?
Yeah, so DIGA is an only Germany only scheme, and I think the law that was put in place back then was the absolute right thing. I think it's much more debatable whether the interpretation and the way it was operationalized.
I don't understand what you mean. So what do you mean by the interpretation?
Yeah, so there was a law that the Minister of Health, Jens Spahn, at the time put out with his team, Gottfried Ludewig and others that were involved. And this law basically paved the way for allowing or actually ensuring that every patient has the right to get a digital therapeutic reimbursed by statutory health insurance in Germany. And so there's the BfArM, which is the institute that regulates drugs and medical devices in Germany, or the government agency. It was upon them to come up with this more detailed out regulation, basically.
So it's like the Bible and the Catechism, kind of.
I'm sure they would love that parallel. And I think there's a lot of criticism of how that agency has handled and is handling this. And but to be fair, there's also a lot of pressure on the other side, because you have health insurances that are highly deficitary in Germany right now. So they have huge budget problems, and they're not particularly eager to have every patient to get thousands of euros per year reimbursed on top of what's already out there in terms of treatments. Right? So, and they claimed that this is, going to be a huge cost issue. I think that has not materialized to their benefit, but to the detriment of the offerers of digital therapeutics, of course.
Yeah.
I think when this started, everybody was very excited about finally having sort of a standard way of getting this reimbursed. This is how it works, and a lot of momentum behind it. And I think a couple of years in now, there's a bit of a sobering, how well does this really work? How much revenue can you actually generate with this? Does this really warrant a large business that's VC backed, right? And I think that's where some question marks are coming up. And I think this strongly also depends, of course, the domain in which you are.
Yeah.
Right. Oncology has a lot fewer patients than obesity or diabetes.
Yeah.
Or depression. And so...
so a reimbursement model that's capped across conditions does not really make sense when you have different patient cohort sizes.
Again, legally it's not capped, but yes. So that doesn't play into our advantage. Plus, it's very hard, like the UX of getting patients to actually have this, to actually use this is so bad. And this is what I meant a little bit in terms of interpretation of the law. When they came up with this law, they probably didn't think, let's make it so hard that almost nobody will get through this. That probably wasn't their guiding principle, or it definitely wasn't the guiding principle. But what has turned out is that, as a patient, if you want a digital therapeutic, you've heard of this, I want it, you have to go to your physician who, in many cases, doesn't know about it, and they have to write a prescription for it. With that prescription, you don't go to a pharmacy or somewhere else. You have to go to your health insurance, who are, as we just debated, are not the biggest proponents of digital therapeutics. And by the way, there are exceptions to that. Some of them are much more accepted than others. And then a few days or a few weeks, or in some cases even more than a month later, you get an activation code. That's
crazy.
13 digits that you can enter into your platform. So that's not a great UX, right? And if you think about it, so this is a new class of therapeutics. If you get a drug prescribed by a physician and you have to wait 4 weeks to get it, you'd be pretty pissed in most cases, right?
Yeah, I mean like if you had to wait 4 weeks to get anything.
Exactly. So, this is 2023, right?
Yeah.
So, that's I think where the system needs to and should evolve. For us, there was another component in terms of distribution that it's really, really expensive to get to oncologists, right? To do ourselves sales into the oncology domain. Because there's not the oncology domain, right? There's gynecologists, there's urologists, there's hemato-oncologists, there are pulmonologists, there are dermatologists, and they all treat cancer patients, right?
Yeah.
So, and then you have hospital-based ones and private practice ones. So it's a very fragmented system, but it's also more than 100 different diseases, right? It's not, so that's also natural, I guess. But in this domain, you are competing in terms of attention by physicians. You're competing with the large pharma sales forces. Right, because
But you went down the large pharma routes, essentially.
So but that's a different. So I was just at the DIGA part where if we wanted to distribute our digital therapeutic, and it would be at the price of €250, you have the guys from all the big onco players out there who have a margin of, I don't know, in some cases hundreds of thousands of euros per treatment, that also want the same attention. So economically, that's not going to be a great position to be in the long term, right? And so our thinking was we need to leverage that, right? We need to work with them. And in oncology, the cancer is treated by the drugs and radiation or whatever and surgery, and we can contribute to the best outcome of the treatment. But I'm, let's say, not that visionary to say, in X amount of years, the app is going to cure the cancer. That's not going to happen. It will significantly improve the outcomes. That I'm sure of. But I think there will always be another component. And that's different in obesity, right? Or in depression. Right?
But I mean, congrats, because we're talking about how you can even build a VC-backed digital therapeutic, and you've managed to do it, one that is actually commercializing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, but but we're also still at the beginning of this, right? Maybe not in terms of years into the company, but everything starts with an unmet need, with tons of research and constant involvement of patients. You need to build a great product, you need to generate clinical evidence, and then you can start thinking about commercialization. Well, you should have thought about it before, but that's when you can start actually commercializing, right? Because that's when you have value in your hand. And that's really not something that started in 2017, that's a more recent thing. So, and overall, I think it's a very young industry, right? It's not known by anything.
We've seen companies with all four of these things that have gone horribly wrong, right? Let's think about Pear Bio, for example.
Sure.
And a lot of US companies who maybe are VC backed as well, and have had to turn to, okay, now patient maybe has to pay model.
Yeah. I think, I mean, who am I to judge Pear or anyone else really? I think you can debate whether opioid abuse or addiction is a great application for digital therapeutic. It's really hard to make that sticky. I think Pear definitely paid a large price for being a trailblazer in this industry. Right? They did a lot of work that others are benefiting from. They also probably went in pretty aggressively, right? So if you raise, if you do a spec of 1.6 billion on 4 million revenues, if that's the ratio that you think of, it's probably not the metric that they were pitching to investors at the point.
Were they valued at 1.6 billion for 4 million of
I think
revenue?
that was the spec that they did. Yeah. So, and I mean, to be fair, some people bought it at the time, and they are also smart people. So there was reasoning behind it, and I think it also takes some level of being a visionary to pull that off, and also to build a new industry. You start somewhere, right? And then I think yes, there are some examples like that out there, but it's also not the end of the industry. It's not that everybody's folding here, and I think you will see more folding, which is true across industry, by the way, because we're in an economic crisis to some degree. But you also see thriving ones, and you also have to always remind yourself that this is still the beginning of this industry. Right? It's, new classes of therapeutics don't just come to life and overnight they are everywhere and successful. I think there's different angles that are being tested and models tried and partnerships. Tons of piloting happening, and I think we're slowly getting to a point where things are consolidating a little bit, where it becomes a little bit clear of what works and what doesn't. But that's not a fast process, right? Anyone who is in or works in or invests into healthcare is probably highly aware that healthcare is not the quick play typically, right?
Yeah, and then if you were to expand into the US, is the market size now higher? And
I mean, the US is, particularly if you look at drugs, right? Actually, anything, but drugs, it's very obvious. So I think large pharma companies do 50, if not more, % of their global revenues typically in the US. Depends on the company, of course, but it's not 50 or 60% of the people that live in the US, right? So it's highly disproportionate, and so it's for many reasons the most attractive market to get into. It's also the most difficult one to be in, A, because it's super expensive, and B, because it's super competitive. Right? There are lots of other companies there that are trying to do similar things to what you're doing. So but I think if you have the right things in hand in terms of clinical evidence, in terms of a working product, in terms of regulatory aspects covered, a commercial model that can scale in the US, and ideally you have partners to already work with over there, then I think that can work. And you need some money.
Yeah. Well, now you have some, so that's interesting.
It's always debatable. I mean, I think we as a VC-backed business, you're in constant mode of fundraising. Of course, you're talking to investors all over the world, and you need to, of course, paint the picture. What will this be in 5 or 10 years, right? And I think that's a very exciting thought experiment of what this can get into, and of course, you need to at that point also consider the competitive landscape. Who is actually out there? Who's doing what in the US? And in at least the past, let's say 2, 3, 4 years, it's always been significantly easier to raise big rounds in the US than anywhere else. And I think that's still true, right? I mean, valuations are, even though they've come down significantly, they're still higher
in the US.
Well, because you have a bigger market, right? And if you are the biggest player in something in the US, that's something else than being the biggest player in Germany. Right? There's just a lot more people, there's a lot more economic momentum and potential there. So,
if you had to start again, would you still start in Germany?
Yes, I mean, so I'm German. I know the German healthcare system. I think we wouldn't have been. I mean, actually, I lived in the US before I came back to build this in Germany. So, but my network was still better in Germany, and felt like the healthcare system, even though I'd worked in healthcare in the US, I still know the German system better. The personal reasons why I started in Germany, and so yes, I would still do it here. But it's a fair question. I think a lot of companies have to answer why, should probably ask themselves the question, why are they not already in the US?
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, you found the business where you are typically, right? You don't say, oh, let's move all the variables in this equation. I'm going to move to that place because it's the biggest market, but I don't know anyone there. I think that's typically what happens. You have an idea, you build it where you are, and then you grow from there. But in healthcare, for many, many players, I think the US is the obvious most important market.
And in your journey from basically idea to now post Series A, what's been like the most challenging part of it? Like, what was like the one moment where you're like, I might quit. I don't know, like, you know what I mean?
It's an interesting question. So I think I was never close to quitting. I think the company went through tough times, and if that had gone significantly further south, it wouldn't have been me quitting, but the company quitting me. But that didn't happen. So I think there are some stages in terms of when you grow in headcount that brings complexity into it. So I think
which stage?
I think there's sort of a phase, and don't pin me down on numbers, but I think there's sort of a phase until maybe 12, 15 people where it's sort of everybody knows everyone really well. You can sit in one room, and the meetings that you have are anyways everyone, and so that's a lot easier. And then at some point, you do organize that a little bit, right? But you don't necessarily have a leadership team at that point, right? You cannot have department heads when you have one person working in that department. You can, but you can't do that for five, and then you have a sort of a mid management level. And I think then there's another point probably. There's a point probably around, I would say maybe 20 people where you should have thought about, and maybe you should already have an HR function.
An HR function?
Yeah, so someone taking care of HR.
Okay.
That's not the founders or CEO or whatever.
And you were doing that basically.
And I think it's a learning in hindsight. We probably should have done that earlier. And then I think there's a beyond then, I don't know, 30 or something, where you will need to think about a strong second level of management to really organize and get people who are really in the details of what the department is doing and what they're working on, and to set the right goals, etc., and to professionalize a little bit in that sense, right? So working with OKR, whatever system you're using, to really make them work. I think you need strong owners of that. So there's an organizational maturity I think that's needed, and our company is not that much bigger, so I can't talk about all the other stages further down the line. But I think that already puts you in place to then grow from there, right? Because I think once you have that organized fairly well, you can go to 100 or 200 technically, and I'm sure there are other problems that will come along. But putting structures in place when you know that you want to grow aggressively forward-looking, then I think that's needed.
Why do you need so many people, though?
Well, it depends on what you do. WhatsApp
like
needed 17 people. But,
for like a GTX, right? Because it's just like a digital app.
Yeah, but again, it depends on what you do. So you have developers, you have, well, I don't know where to start, but you have a tech team with Q&A, front end, back end. Then you have we call that sort of core product. So there's product owners, user researchers, designers, etc. You have a content team or patient programs, we call, so they actually develop the interventions and all the content. That's not even all of this in-house, so we work with a large body of freelancers there who think about tone of voice, who think about formats, who may leverage generative AI in some of this. So that's happening. Then you have a clinical team that does both planning, forward-looking, what clinical trials do we do, running the clinical trials as much as involved as we are, and then publishing them, getting word of mouth out. You have marketing, both HCP and so healthcare professional and patient-facing, and general company marketing and PR. You have business development in terms of pharma partnerships, take that forward. You have regulatory, HR, administration, and then you have management level. I think that's maybe everything in the company. So, and in all of those roles, you start off with one person. We had, a few years back, we had a person who was who did all of regulatory and was a coder and I don't know, probably did something else and was sort of sysadmin for some office stuff. So that's great for an initial phase. And I think that's also one big learning that you go through different stages and you need different people in different stages, right? And as you grow, what you need becomes much more specialized, of course. No rocket science behind this, but you start off with few people and you need to get a product out, so you need people who can do
everything,
more of the product. And then as you go, you have more specialized people who are very good at certain things on the value chain, basically.
And what's the number one thing that you would recommend someone to do if they wanted to build a healthcare startup?
Understand the system really well. So I think there are so many niches where people are making tons of money in this industry, arguably not in all cases well-deserved. And there are cases where you have great impact on the world and with patients and even with the healthcare system where companies go bankrupt because they have difficulty in actually capturing the value, right, or commercializing. So I think that's a key thing. Understand the right partners, understand the industry, and understand how you're going to commercialize that. And in our industry, that's hard, right? The industry didn't exist 20 years ago, or arguably 15 years ago. That's probably the one thing to get right. I mean, also a close second, or even also first, would be get people right. So I think
get the team right.
Yeah, you can only ever build something visionary great if you have great people on board. And I think we were, in many cases, extremely blessed to have wonderful people that we found wherever. And I think that was, by the way, one of the key reasons why we came to Berlin We originally we were in Frankfurt, and at the time I think it's a little bit different now, and much respect on what is developed there. We started off in Frankfurt in Germany, but I think a few months in we thought, okay, this is probably not where we want to or can build this company.
Because the people, the talent were in Berlin.
Yeah, Frankfurt is very different, that it doesn't have a historical background of being a tech city, much higher living costs, so it doesn't attract so many, let's say, young people, and I mean, it attracts young people into banking and consulting and high-paid jobs, and that's great. And by the way, it's very black and white, right? So, as I said, I think the city has definitely evolved quite a bit and has a much more vibrant tech scene by now. But Berlin has always attracted, more visionary and crazy people that want to change the world, and so that plus it's a lot bigger. You can get by with English really well in Berlin, so I think it made it easier. It's become a bit harder. Housing is getting hard in Berlin. We see that a lot in new joiners that find it difficult to find an apartment. But overall, it still has much to offer for young talent, and it's reasonably cheap compared to definitely other capitals in Europe.
I read this study that analyzed basically unicorn companies, right? Companies valued over $1 billion. And they found something very interesting, which is like pretty much there isn't really a trend of why they succeeded, but in terms of the people, they had a significantly higher age gap between the oldest person and the youngest person.
Interesting.
And I wonder, what you think of that, or how, or if you've seen that in kind of MIKA. Yeah. I'm not aware of this study. Overall, I think being valued at a unicorn just means that an investor thought that you're worth more than $1 billion. Yeah.
But it doesn't mean you can sell at $1 billion, right?
That's true. Maybe 4 million.
It's a bunch of people having a very high conviction that this company is worth a lot of money. And granted, a lot of the unicorns probably are also real unicorns, and they really represent that value. So I don't want to get into too much of a unicorn general discussion, but I think there's generally value in diversity.
Yeah.
So be it from age, gender, background, education, etc. I think that makes teams better, and also makes the product and result better at the end of the day. So I would agree with that. I think we've hired for pretty professional people in general. So more on the, at least initially, more on the let's say experienced side, and as we had some structures in place, we've definitely gone on to hire younger talent also. And I think that was important. We probably should have started that a little bit earlier in hindsight, but always smarter in hindsight. And when you're looking into hiring people, and it's not like you can build your candidate. The candidate comes to you, right?
Yeah. And what's the number one thing not to do when building a healthcare startup?
I'd say don't do too many things. So I think focus is key, and I probably sound like a textbook here or whatever blog article, but I think that's actually key. When we did both DIGA and pharma business models in parallel, we found that difficult to get either of them really done well. And I think that it was good for us to focus on one. And I think it's also good that it's pharma at the end of the day. So I think, you have so much complexity anyways in this, and I think if you figure it out for one thing and that really, really works, then you can go on. We've been always approached by companies saying, oh, if you do this in oncology, you can do it anywhere. Why don't you go into all these other indications? But we really find we win RFPs against big competitors that have raised 10 times of what we have raised in terms of money. So We win RFPs against these companies because we have this focus, and because we really understand cancer patients. We've had a lot of interaction there, and so I think that was key for us so far. Let's see where this takes us.
Awesome. And what's the number one impact you want to leave on the world with MIKA?
I want to ensure that every patient has the chance and is empowered to get the best possible treatment outcome. So in cancer. And I think that's it's doable with digital technology, and it's going to take a long time, and it's hard, but I think we're going to be the company that does that.